Dan Bongino leaned closer to the microphone and stated that he intended to expose her as the greatest fraud in the history of Congress. He spoke with the calm demeanor of a weatherman delivering a forecast, or someone stating a simple fact that everyone present would soon acknowledge as the truth. The House Oversight Committee hearing room fell into a complete and sudden silence as every camera and staff member froze in anticipation. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez laughed in response, but it was not a nervous sound. Rather, it was a rehearsed performance she had likely practiced before mirrors. It was the kind of laugh that signaled she felt this man was beneath her, and it was calculated to play perfectly for her Instagram followers. She leaned into her own microphone while her $3,000 blazer caught the studio lights at exactly the right angle. Her team had selected that specific jacket for the television cameras and had spent nearly an hour perfecting her makeup earlier that morning. This was intended to be her moment to shine and create another viral clip where she destroyed a Republican witness. She thought it amusing that a failed police officer turned podcaster was going to lecture her about the concept of fraud. She paused for dramatic effect and looked around the room with theatrical disbelief before asking if he planned to sell her gold coins or survival food. Scattered laughter erupted from the Democratic side of the room, while a few staffers pulled out their phones to record what they assumed would be a legendary rebuttal. She was entirely in her element now because this behavior was exactly who she was and what she did best. She was the queen of the comeback and the warrior of social media, who believed herself to be the voice of a generation. She suggested that perhaps he should stick to shouting into a microphone for angry baby boomers and leave the real work to those who understood policy. A staffer gave her a thumbs up, while Bongino remained perfectly still with his hands folded on the table. He watched her performance with the deep patience of a man who had spent 12 years serving in the Secret Service. He had protected presidents and faced genuine threats to his life, so he had learned the discipline of waiting. The laughter eventually faded, and the silence in the room began to stretch out uncomfortably long. Her smile flickered for just a moment because she was not accustomed to opponents who refused to react to her taunts. She fed on reactions and needed them to sustain her momentum, but Bongino simply asked if she was finished. His voice was flat and unimpressed as she retorted that she was just getting started and called him a tough guy who represented everything wrong with government. Bongino reached down to open his briefcase, which was made of worn leather and looked practical rather than fancy. He replied that he was also just getting started and pulled out a single manila folder that was neither thick nor dramatic. He placed it on the table and positioned it precisely so that every camera in the room could read the typed label on the front. The label read, "Ocasio-Cortez the Fraud," and the room stirred as whispers rippled through the gallery. $47 million was the figure Bongino let hang in the air without rushing the delivery to give the words space to breathe. That was the amount of money that had flowed through her network of political action committees and shell companies in just 4 years. It was $47 million from people who believed in her, and he claimed to know where every single penny went. He looked directly at her with steady eyes and promised that by the time he finished, everyone watching would know too. He pulled out the first document and told her she should have remained a bartender, because that was at least an honest job. Ocasio-Cortez opened her mouth to respond and deliver the sharp retort she always had ready, but no words came out. For the first time in her political career, she found herself with absolutely nothing to say, while Dan Bongino was only beginning his presentation. He flipped to the first section of the folder with the methodical patience of a man who had built cases against drug cartels. Every gesture he made was deliberate, and every pause was calculated. As he proposed, they start with something simple, like how she lived. She rolled her eyes with practiced dismissiveness and muttered about the right-wing obsession with her clothes being unoriginal. He clarified that he was not interested in her clothes, but rather the canyon between what she preached and how she actually lived her life. He pulled out a lease agreement and noted that she talked frequently about affordable housing being a human right. She had claimed working families were being crushed by rent and forced out of their neighborhoods to choose between food and shelter. He set the lease on the table, which showed her apartment in the Navy Yard cost $3,500 a month. It was a luxury building featuring a rooftop pool and a fitness center, along with a 24-hour concierge service. He looked up at her and stated that her rent was more than most families in her district earned in an entire month. He clarified he meant their total income from working 2 or 3 jobs rather than just their housing costs. She shifted in her seat, and her posture changed slightly in a way the cameras managed to catch. He anticipated her defense that members of Congress needed to maintain 2 residences due to standard housing prices in the Capitol. He pulled out a spreadsheet with highlighted rows showing available apartments within 2 miles of the Capitol building. There were plenty of options under $2,000 and some under $1,500 that were modest places where working people lived. He set the list down and noted that she did not want those places because she wanted the luxury building with amenities her constituents would never experience. He pointed out that her building cost more per month than some of her voters earned in 6 weeks of full-time work. He paused to say there was nothing wrong with wanting nice things or enjoying success. The problem was building a political brand on telling other people they could not have nice things while she lived in luxury. Her attorney leaned over to whisper something, but she waved him away with an irritated gesture. Bongino moved to the next exhibit to discuss the Green New Deal, which was her signature legislation that made her a national figure. He pulled out a thick document and reminded her that she stood on the House floor calling climate change an existential threat. She had said they had 12 years to act or the world would end, and every American needed to radically change their lifestyle. He pulled out a spreadsheet showing 66 flights in 12 months, exposed in official aviation records. Every single one of those flights was booked in first class or business class, which caused the room to stir. Her personal carbon footprint from air travel alone was larger than that of 20 average American families combined in a single year. He set the spreadsheet down and noted she wanted working people to give up their cars and stop eating meat. She wanted them to fundamentally transform their lives to save the planet while she enjoyed the comfort of first class. She grabbed her microphone with a higher-pitched voice to claim those were work flights for official congressional business. Bongino pulled out a photograph and held it up so every camera could see it clearly. It showed Miami Beach in February while Texas was freezing and people were literally dying without power or heat. The photo showed her in a bikini with a champagne glass in hand, laughing on a beach cabana. She flew to Florida for a fundraiser at a beachfront mansion while her colleagues were organizing relief efforts. Her constituents in New York were dealing with their own winter weather emergencies while she enjoyed the sun. He set the photo down and noted the image was posted by a friend of hers on Instagram before being deleted within an hour. He reminded her that nothing ever truly disappears from the internet and pulled out another image. It showed her 2 days later back in New York, tweeting about climate justice and the urgent need for the Green New Deal. He looked at her with something approaching pity and remarked that the champagne on the beach must have been nice, though. Her face flushed red, and her hands gripped the edge of the table as she stammered that it was a previously scheduled event. Bongino interrupted because he was not interested in her explanations as he continued building his case. He noted she championed defunding the police and claimed communities did not need armed officers patrolling their streets. She had said the money should go to social services and mental health workers instead of cops. He spread out a new set of documents detailing her personal security expenses for the last 2 years. Her office had tried very hard to bury these expenses in paperwork, but he pointed to the numbers. Over $70,000 was exposed right there in black and white for armed private security. He looked at her and emphasized these were trained professionals with guns to keep her safe. She told single mothers in the Bronx they did not need police protection while she spent a fortune on her own safety. She argued it was different because she received credible death threats. Bongino hardened his voice and countered that her constituents faced death threats too. The single mother working the night shift and the elderly man walking home from church faced real threats every single day. The difference was they could not afford $70,000 in private security. She wanted to take away the only protection they had, which caused the room to fall completely silent. Even the clicking of keyboards had stopped as Bongino pulled out one more set of documents from this section. This concerned her staff and the young idealists who believed in her message and wanted to be part of her movement. He read from an official filing regarding anonymous complaints filed with the Office of Congressional Ethics. He quoted that the Congresswoman demanded absolute loyalty but treated staff like personal servants. Unpaid overtime was expected, and any complaints were met with threats about career consequences. He flipped to another page stating she preached about workers' rights on television but ran her own office like a sweatshop. Interns worked full-time hours with no compensation while she gave speeches about living wages. Another quote described two versions of her where the public one cared about people and the private one screamed at junior staff for coffee errors. He set the documents down and noted the champion of the working class could not even treat her own workers with basic decency. Her voice cracked as she claimed those complaints were never substantiated and were merely anonymous accusations. Bongino countered that they were sworn statements filed under penalty of perjury from people who worked for her. They were people who believed in her and saw who she really was when the cameras were not rolling. He closed that section of the folder and remarked that living like a hypocrite was not actually a crime, but just sad. It was pathetic proof that she did not believe a single word of what she preached. He opened the next section where the pages were thicker and more dense. This was where they got to the actual crimes, and he took a slow breath before continuing. He understood pacing and how to build tension for the section that would end careers. He stated they needed to talk about money, specifically the $47 million that flowed through her political network. He pulled out a complex diagram with lines connecting boxes and arrows showing flows of money. Names and organizations were tangled together like a web involving 3 organizations all connected to her. They were moving money in patterns that would make a professional money launderer jealous. She forced a dismissive laugh, claiming those were legitimate political organizations supporting progressive candidates. Bongino held up the diagram and said those organizations were used to move money in circles until no one could trace it. He offered to walk her through it step by step, simply enough for everyone at home to understand. He pointed to the first box where donations came in to brand new Congress PAC from small donors. These were working people who believed in her message about fighting corruption and representing the little guy. They gave $20 or $50, and some skipped meals to afford the donation. He traced a line on the chart showing that money getting paid to a private limited liability company for campaign services. Another line showed that company paying a firm called Middle Seat Consulting for more services. He looked up and asked her to guess who controlled Middle Seat Consulting. Silence filled the room as he revealed it was her former chief of staff. It was the same man who founded Justice Democrats and recruited her to run for Congress in the first place. He noted this man discovered her at a casting call for progressive candidates, which he confirmed was a real event. The money went in a circle from PAC to LLC to consulting firm and back into the pockets of her inner circle. Along the way, millions of dollars simply disappeared into vague categories like operating expenses. He pulled out official filings showing over $1 million in payments that could not be properly accounted for. The documentation was missing, and the services were undefined, so the money just vanished. The Federal Election Commission had received multiple formal complaints about these arrangements and had been investigating for years. The only reason charges had not been filed was because the commission had been deadlocked along partisan lines. He looked at her and stated the FBI did not have that problem, and they were looking at this very carefully. Her attorney was writing furiously on a legal pad and looked visibly pale. Bongino continued by saying they should talk about something more specific involving her boyfriend. The room went very still because this was personal now, as he named her longtime partner, Riley Roberts. He noted Riley was a nice guy, but not a political operative or campaign strategist. His background was in web development, yet payment records showed he received $6,000 a month. Her campaign paid him every month for over a year for marketing consulting. Bongino did the math out loud, stating that was more than $72,000 from donor money. He looked at her and asked what he produced and what marketing strategies he developed. He asked what deliverables existed with his name on them, and the silence stretched on. Bongino answered for her that there was nothing and no portfolio of work. There was no evidence he did anything at all to earn that money. It was just checks written to her boyfriend from funds donated by working people supporting a movement. She raised her voice defensively to claim Riley provided valuable digital strategy and ongoing consultation. Bongino cut through her explanation, demanding she show the committee one single piece of work. He asked for one strategy document or one email chain discussing deliverables. She did not respond because she had nothing to show. He stated he had reviewed every filing and his name appeared only on payment records, never on work product. He pulled out another piece of paper and said this was where it got really interesting involving Maria Gonzalez. He paused to let the name settle into the room before describing her as a single mother in the Bronx. Maria worked 2 jobs cleaning office buildings at night and working at a laundromat during the day. She made about $14 an hour with no benefits and no sick days. He looked at the document showing Maria donated $50 to the campaign in 2018. That $50 represented a full day of wages for her, and she had to skip buying groceries to afford it. She believed in the candidate and saw someone who looked like her and promised to fight for the forgotten. He tapped the payment record for Riley Roberts and said Maria's $50 helped pay the boyfriend $6,000 a month. Her donation went to subsidize the boyfriend's lifestyle while she skipped meals for her kids. Her eyes were getting wet, whether from emotion or calculation, as she called it, a gross mischaracterization. Bongino pulled out an email printout from her personal account to her chief of staff, dated March 2019. He read slowly, ensuring every word was captured by the microphones, about making sure transfers did not look connected. The email instructed to use different entity names so small donors could never find out who benefited. It explicitly said to keep it clean on paper, which he set down on the table. That was not a staff accounting error or confusion about finance regulations. It was her personally instructing her staff to hide where the money was going. A Democratic member shifted uncomfortably, and the ranking member stared at the table, refusing eye contact. She told Maria Gonzalez her money was funding a revolution and a fight for the working class. Bongino hardened his voice, stating it was actually funding her inner circle and personal lifestyle. He pulled out one final document showing the total donor money that went to entities she controlled. Based on corporate registry records, $4.2 million went to her boyfriend or close associates. He let that number sit in the air as the amount taken from people like Maria Gonzalez. These were people who sacrificed for her because they believed she was different from other politicians. He closed that section of the folder, noting that was just the money they could trace to Americans. Not all the money came from Americans, and he opened the next section where the story got dark. Bongino turned to a new tab in the folder which had photographs clipped to the top. He began with June 24, 2018, which was a date that transformed her entire career. He held up the famous photograph that every person in America had seen. It showed her at the border fence in Texas, with her hand pressed over her mouth and tears streaming. The image of compassion confronting cruelty went viral within hours and was shared millions of times. It launched 1,000 news segments and turned her from a long-shot challenger into a national icon. He set it down gently, describing the young congresswoman overcome with emotion at the sight of separated families. It was powerful and moving, and exactly what the moment needed. But there was a problem with the narrative. He held up another photograph taken 5 minutes before the famous shot at the same location. The photographer had kept all his images and shared the complete sequence with federal investigators. The second photo showed her in the same outfit at the same fence, but she was laughing with her staff. She was checking her makeup in a phone screen and adjusting her hair for the cameras. A third image taken 12 minutes later showed her smiling broadly and posing for selfies with supporters. Her makeup was fresh and perfect, and there was not a tear in sight. Her grief lasted exactly as long as needed for the photographers to get the shot. She shook her head vigorously, claiming the photos were out of context, and she was genuinely overwhelmed. Bongino pulled out a text message log from her communications director sent 3 hours before she arrived. It instructed to position photographers at the fence and to have tissues ready for the emotion shot. It told her to think about something sad if she needed help getting the tears going. He set it down and repeated the phrase emotion shot, calling it a performance to be manufactured. He pulled out another text exchange sent from her to her campaign manager 2 hours later. It said the crying picture was blowing up and would be massive for fundraising. It instructed them to get the donation page ready to capitalize before the news cycle moved on. His voice dropped lower and harder as he reminded her the children in those facilities were real. Their fear and confusion were real, and she used them as props for a fundraising email. Her voice cracked with what might have been genuine emotion, claiming she cared deeply and fought for reform. Bongino pulled out a calendar document showing her official schedule for the 2 years following the photo. He asked to count how many times she visited a border facility to actually engage with the issue. The answer was 0, because she never went back once the photo op was finished. However, she did find time to do over 400 media interviews about the border. She found time for magazine shoots and to raise over $11 million off immigration appeals. She just never found time to go back and do anything substantive about the problem. He spread out printouts of her social media posts calling facilities concentration camps. She compared border agents to Nazi guards and said America sponsored terror against children. Those strong words were designed to generate maximum outrage and maximum donations. He pulled out a document showing those words put targets on the backs of federal agents. He read an incident report about 3 Border Patrol agents assaulted by protesters, citing her rhetoric. Agent Manuel Padilla was hospitalized for 2 weeks with a severe concussion and broken ribs. His wife and 3 young children spent those weeks wondering if their father would ever be the same. She got her headlines while Agent Padilla got brain damage and broken bones. Bongino moved to the next page to examine what she actually did for immigration policy legislatively. He held up a thin document representing every piece of legislation she sponsored in 4 years. It contained resolutions and symbolic gestures designed to generate social media engagement. Not a single substantive bill became law, and not one policy change helped an immigrant family. He pulled out financial records showing open border advocacy groups donated heavily to her. These organizations pushed for abolishing deportations and removing barriers to entry. Some of them had been flagged by law enforcement for concerning connections to chaos profiteers. She slammed her hand on the table, calling it an outrageous and racist insinuation. Bongino held up a Department of Homeland Security report regarding funding networks undermining border security. Her PACs received donations from 3 groups specifically named in that report. He asked if she checked where the money came from or did any due diligence at all. Silence followed as he stated she just cashed the checks and kept performing. He leaned forward to remind her that thousands of migrants die crossing the desert because of open border lies. Women are assaulted, and families pay their savings to criminal organizations who leave them to die. His voice was hard and angry as he accused her of profiting from the chaos. She built her political brand on the bodies of people she claimed to care about. He closed that section but noted exploiting immigrants was not even the worst thing she had done. He opened the final major section regarding what she really thought about her voters. Bongino paused, and his voice changed to something quieter and almost sad. He said this part was going to hurt the most for the people watching at home. He looked toward the cameras, addressing the people who saw her as a symbol of hope. He started with Amazon, and she visibly stiffened, gripping the edge of the table. In 2019, Amazon announced plans to build a headquarters in her district of Queens. It promised 25,000 professional jobs with high average salaries. It meant direct investment of billions and tax revenue for schools and infrastructure. She led the opposition organizing protests and calling it corporate welfare for a billionaire. Amazon pulled out and took those jobs and billions of dollars somewhere else. She celebrated it as a victory for the people, and her supporters cheered. He paused to ask exactly which people it was a victory for as he pulled out an email. It was sent to a major donor 1 week after Amazon withdrew. He read the quote stating the Amazon deal would have gentrified the district within 5 years. The tech workers would have voted for centrist Democrats or Republicans. It was better to keep the current voter base of poor people who depended on government programs. They were her path to power, and the hearing room was absolutely silent. He stated she did not kill those jobs on principle, but because secure voters might not need her. She killed 25,000 chances for working people to build wealth and achieve the American dream. She killed it deliberately because their success would have threatened her political power. She was shaking now and claimed the email was taken out of context. He asked what context meant it was better to keep them poor and dependent. She could not answer, so he pulled out phone records regarding her personal thoughts. These were text messages from her personal cell phone obtained legally through a warrant. He read a message to a college friend from 2021 about Bronx people being easy to manipulate. It said if she said socialism and threw in Spanish phrases, they cheered like trained seals. Gasps came from the gallery, and a staffer walked out of the room. He read another message saying they would vote for her no matter what she did. She wrote they were not smart enough to realize they were being played. Another text called the Bronx just a brand like a logo she owned. She wrote she would never in a million years actually live there again. Bongino set the records down, noting these were her private thoughts when she felt safe. Her voice was a broken whisper, claiming she was venting about pressure. He asked what context made it acceptable to call her voters trained seals. He asked what context made it okay to say they were too stupid to know they were being played. He asked what context justified calling her district a brand she owned. There was no context that made any of that acceptable except contempt. He pulled out documents regarding who she actually employed in her office. He spread out personnel records for 14 full-time staffers in her congressional office. 12 of them were from out of state and moved to New York to work for her. 10 had Ivy League degrees, and only 2 actually grew up in her district. The champion of the Bronx could not find qualified workers from the Bronx. Her Hispanic outreach coordinator was raised in suburban Connecticut and attended Yale. She did not speak fluent Spanish, but she had the right family connections and school ties. Meanwhile, young people in the district who knew the community were ignored. She never gave them a chance because they lacked the right credentials. Bongino pulled out one more piece of evidence regarding her heritage and identity. She presented herself as a Latina from the Bronx and a daughter of the working class. He pulled out a transcript from a Univision interview she gave the previous year. A professional linguist reviewed the tape and said she spoke Spanish at a tourist level. Her pronunciation was Americanized, and her grammar was consistently incorrect. The errors suggested someone who learned Spanish as a second language in school. She performed being Latina for the cameras, using phrases as props. She was crying now with mascara running, claiming her family was Puerto Rican. Bongino said it was not an attack on Puerto Ricans, but an observation about her performance. He noted she grew up in Yorktown Heights, where the median income was $96,000. It was a wealthy suburb with safe streets and country clubs nearby. There was nothing wrong with having a comfortable childhood or being fortunate. But that was not the story she told to sell herself to donors and voters. She stole the identity of her own community and appropriated their struggle to advance her career. In private, she laughed at them for being stupid enough to believe her. He closed the folder and called it plain and simple fraud rather than democratic socialism. The energy in the room had shifted from political theater to something sadder. She sat slumped in her chair with her makeup ruined and her polished image broken. She demanded the right to respond to the accusations, and the chairman allowed it. She tried to straighten in her chair and summon the fighter who never backed down. She began calling it a political witch hunt and a coordinated attack by right-wing forces. She claimed the evidence was twisted to silence the voice of working people. She looked at the cameras trying to find her audience, claiming they were afraid of her movement. She declared she would not be silenced or intimidated and would not apologize. She turned to face Bongino, calling him a failed cop and a conspiracy theorist. She lifted her chin and said nothing. He said changed who she was. Bongino slowly reached back into his briefcase and asked if she was done. He pulled out one final document, which was a cooperation agreement signed 6 months ago. It was signed by her former chief of staff, who built her entire political operation. The color drained from her face as she realized he had been talking to investigators. He provided the emails and financial records and text messages presented that day. Her boyfriend, Riley Roberts, had also been interviewed twice by the FBI. He provided records of every payment, proving he did nothing to earn them. 4 former staff members gave sworn statements about the abuse and working conditions. She called it a witch hunt, but the evidence was documented and corroborated. She turned desperately to her colleagues in the squad, who had always stood beside her. She begged Ilhan and Rashida and Ayana to say something and defend her. Representative Omar studied her notes intently, while Representative Clyde stared at her phone. Representative Presley looked away toward the gallery at nothing in particular. Bongino said quietly that they were not coming to rescue her because they knew for weeks. He pulled out printed statements released by her colleagues distancing themselves. Representative Omar claimed no knowledge of the financial arrangements. Representative Tlaib wished her well, but noted offices were responsible for their own compliance. Representative Presley had unfollowed her on social media and deleted their photos. They saw the evidence and calculated the odds and chose to save themselves. She looked around the room with growing desperation at her staff and colleagues. She was utterly alone and whispered like a child that it wasn't fair. She claimed she was trying to help people and make a difference. Bongino responded with a voice that was tired and disappointed rather than cruel. He suggested maybe she believed that once at the beginning. But somewhere along the way, she started believing she was special and above the rules. She treated supporters as tools rather than citizens to be served. He did not think she was evil, but rather someone who got famous too fast. She got lost somewhere between her first viral tweet and her 50th magazine cover. He stood up saying that did not undo the damage or give back the money. Chairman James cleared his throat and addressed the room formally regarding the evidence. He directed staff to prepare a formal referral to the Department of Justice for criminal investigation. He also recommended the House Ethics Committee open its own investigation immediately. He strongly advised her to retain experienced legal counsel and adjourn the hearing. She tried to stand, but her legs did not cooperate, so she grabbed the table. She pushed away staff who tried to help and walked toward the door, alone. A blinding storm of camera flashes and shouting reporters met her. They asked if she would resign and what she said to the donors who trusted her. She did not answer because words had abandoned her completely. She left the room and her career ended with silence and closed doors. The news spread faster than anyone predicted, and social media exploded. Within hours, the first calls for resignation came from her own party. In the Bronx, Maria Gonzalez sat in her small apartment watching the news coverage. She held a donation receipt from years ago when she believed the story. She had told her daughters to look at this woman who fought for people like them. She cried, remembering how she skipped groceries to send that money. She realized she had been laughed at by a woman with rich friends. She said the woman broke something bigger than trust by making them afraid to believe. The worst part was not the money, but the hope that was stolen. Across the district, similar scenes played out in bodegas and diners. People who had given their votes and dreams watched their faith collapse. They realized they had been given a performance instead of help. Dan Bongino gave only one interview that evening and refused to say he was proud. He said there was nothing to be proud of in a young woman destroying her career. The district still lacked jobs and immigrants still suffered at the border. He had simply exposed the situation and let people draw conclusions. He felt sympathy for who she could have been if she had been honest. Later that night, he sat alone in his home office with the folder filed away. He thought about the young woman who was once a true believer. She made small compromises that grew into big lies until the performance took over. His phone buzzed with a message about a new file on his desk. It was a different name, but the same pattern of broken promises. He filed the folder away and turned off the light to go home to his family. 3 days later, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez submitted her resignation from Congress. She admitted no wrongdoing and did not apologize to the people she called stupid. The investigation continued, and the wheels of justice began to turn. Maria Gonzalez went back to work and threw her poster in the trash.